All right, folks, we are definitely a little bit late covering this story because it came out 3 weeks ago now at this point. I've had no time to include all of this into LTPS, but there is enough here to where it's like we'll just talk about this separately. And it's finally getting some insight into what it was like behind the scenes at Firewalk when Concord came out, and inevitably being shut down, refunded, and the game being completely removed from online stores, and what was a very big public multi-million-dollar failure, not just in PlayStation history, but really games and entertainment history. It was such a big public failure, and so it was always going to be a really interesting thing to finally have some insight on what it was like behind the scenes on the ground at Firewalk, and we finally had that from the podcast A Life Well Wasted from Robert Ashley. They flew out to Seattle and spoke with 11 people from the team across multiple disciplines, that being engineers, producers, artists, things like that. It really runs the gamut. And so we do have a lot of quotes here to digest, which right off the bat, they don't actually say it's Concord or Firewalk or PlayStation. They're being very legally NDA compliant. There's always a conflict of interest to say anything, too harshly. And that might also be part of the reason why there's still a lot of sort of skirting around things here. So there's many aspects of the game they don't directly address. But again, we still have a general sentiment on what it was like at the studio. And so right off the bat, I want to mention that when people initially did join the team, and we heard about this before we got this podcast, but there was indeed some sentiment going on that, hey, this thing we're building is too big to fail. One person said, and I quote here, "Every creative endeavor is a gamble, but from when I first came in 4 years ago, it was like it's too big to fail. There's so much behind this. Even if things go poorly on launch, it's going to be okay, and we'll have a year runway, 2-year runway to kind of right the ship." Another said, quote, "I had all suspicions of this will not be something I'll play, and I don't think a lot of people I know will be into it, but I think I was going into it with, yeah, it's too big to fail, and so I had confidence that we would at least stay afloat." Now, one person with concerns said, quote, "When I first joined, I asked some very hard-hitting questions of like, what are we doing differently than these other situations that are on the market? And I didn't get an answer that I was expecting or satisfied with. So I kind of, from moment one, had a bit of, okay, they'll have to prove it to me. It didn't really happen." Now, getting into the teaser trailer, the reveal trailer, and then ultimately the beta, we have, and I quote here, "I was ecstatic. People were cheering. Only we knew what it was, because the trailer didn't show anything. It just showed kinda our aesthetic, and that's it. So we were excited locally in the studio, but the public had no idea what it was at first. I thought people were just harsh during the reveal trailer. I was like, it's the gaming community. They're not exactly known for being a hyper-positive crowd. There's things we need to work on, but it's okay. Once people touch the game, it's going to change things." And then the beta numbers dropped, and numbers were not what we were expecting. And I think our mindset started shifting to, things could go really bad. Speaking more on the beta, someone said, and I quote, "It made news for how poorly it did, the beta. Like, people would go out to news sites to, hear about our game and how negatively it was doing instead of, hearing what the game was about. People heard about our game because of how poorly it did, but people didn't hear about what the game was or even really tried. There was no shortage of news articles and YouTube videos and hate on the internet about how poor the numbers were, so it was pretty apparent." Someone else said, and I quote, "I mean, it's certainly unpleasant. It was incredibly frustrating that we didn't do any counter-programming, that started immediately after the reveal of the game, and then it was just total radio silence. So a lot of these false narratives around the game got built, and it was outside of our control." Now, going into launch, and I'm going to paraphrase a lot of this here, which I kind of have to do. It's an hour-long podcast, and I don't want to sort of take all the value out of the show. I actually sincerely recommend listening to the entire thing, because there's, of course, a lot of context missing. Oftentimes when they're saying these things, they're joking around and just kind of laughing about the whole thing. They're, generally, I think the hindsight there is that they're still pretty okay with how everything played out, and they get what happened, basically. So not to be too monotone with all the quotes here, but as far as the launch goes, right? So the game comes out day one. We saw that matchmaking, the game was basically dead. They acknowledge that. They're trying to get into one part of the game, and they can't even find people. It wasn't a technical problem. There was just nobody playing. They admitted that every stream on Twitch was sponsored, and when that sponsored stream would stop, their numbers would drop even more. So there was that, and then going offline, of course, it was definitely PlayStation's call. Not entirely surprising there either, given that it's a big multi-million-dollar public company. They're always going to get final say as the publisher. So we do know for a fact that basically nobody on the ground floor was a part of the conversation. They didn't know what was going to happen. And they were all surprised that it got to that point of the game being completely removed and taken offline. Now, getting into more of the reception side of things, here's the quotes we can share. So one of them say, and I quote here, "The most frustrating part about it to me was people had made up their mind about the game, and I felt like it was based off of, this more our fault than theirs, but we did a bad job of communicating what we were trying to do. It's just weird that there is this audience who's just constantly wanting to be excited that something fails, but the reality behind it is we're just looking at our keyboards, and then we're like, oh, no job today." There's like this schadenfreude of, oh, big game fails, and like, that's awesome. We got to see something crash and burn. And like, that's kind of great. That's really cool. And to be a part of that process, it's really easy to bandwagon on that. Like, well, we're punching up and not really taking into consideration that like, well, you're punching up to that, but then all these people that work really hard on it are not those people. Now, there's also one very simple quote here from somebody else that's perhaps the most accurate and honest about the whole thing. They say, quote, "It taught me something important, that there's something worse than making a bad game. It's making an uncool one." And I think that was the big thing. So when Robert heard that, they asked what was uncool. They responded with, and I quote, "The audience our publisher was catering to did not want this game at all from the get-go. The game was labeled as uncool, and so everyone who talked about it was like, yeah, but this game's uncool. Yeah, but you haven't looked into it. You haven't played it. Even my family was like, oh yeah, I've heard about this game. I've heard it wasn't cool." And I was like, bro, you're not even going to play it, please. And they're laughing and joking here, so I want to add that context. Again, it's not all monotone. They're still very lighthearted about the whole thing. But that is definitely one of the more candid parts of the conversation. Now, getting into the aftermath, right? So the studio getting shut down and everything like that. One person said, quote, "One of the things that a lot of people wonder in the comment section is, what are they thinking? How do these devs not know how the game is being received? We know full well. We know what's happening. We agree with it half the time. And more often than not, it's changing the game. It's just not possible given the circumstances, given the stakes, and sunk cost into these things. It was the most beautiful car that we crashed. Any gamers and fellow devs who gave it a chance and enjoyed and appreciated it for what it was, all the love to you guys. I'm sad that it didn't find its gamer base. It was so special. I wouldn't trade the experience for anything." And that's a big key takeaway, too, from a lot of the conversation that we haven't really touched on here. They loved working here, which was probably a really exciting time for a new studio being established, but they were very flattering with just how great it was to work at Firewalk and the general environment. Apparently, they weren't really crunching, too. I mean, there was certainly a level of putting more time into the game, but it sounds like they were all choosing to do a little bit of overtime just in the sense that they were really enjoying the creative process, and people were heard and seen in the environment. So it's great. It does sound like, at least for these 11 folks, they genuinely really loved working at Firewalk. Now, as far as PlayStation, they didn't really get to say a whole lot here, and that's probably the biggest sort of thing they want to have guardrails on, but we do have some quotes here. So one of them is, quote, "The internet will and has said many things about how the game failed, and it was bad, and it was like many bad things about it. But the thing that I think that's missed on a lot of the public perception of that is that if the team is capable of making things as directed, that's valuable. You can absolutely argue about the direction, 100%, I'll be right there with you. It would have been excellent for our parent company to try and work with us a little bit more. It's so expensive and almost impossible to even get 100 people to get together and make something. It's so hard. We could have supported other studios. We could have ramped on to a different project, helped them finish it, and jump. Because we're all in the same business of trying to make money for a big daddy company. And so we should be able to actually work together, and none of that happened." So again, the big takeaway is they really loved the job. They didn't want to go anywhere, even so much to the point where when they got into the conversation of how they found out about the studio closure, and these things tend to happen with very big companies. It's very abrupt. So on the ground, folks usually don't hear about it until day of, and it's almost it's very immediate, basically. So one anecdote that was shared initially in the podcast is that somebody went to go do laundry. They missed the meeting, and 9 minutes later, their Slack channels were cut off. Everything was cut off. Somebody went off and made a Discord so that everyone could actually rejoin and say goodbye to each other, and also be a support channel to one another by, answering questions on how do I file unemployment, how do I file for COBRA, things like that, which is always a really messy thing. Doesn't have to be, specific to Firewalk. That's always usually how that stuff goes, and it's quite ugly. But they didn't really get to address, and they probably didn't want to address certain things like the game price, the character designs, directly addressing online narratives. I think they're just trying to say what they feel comfortable saying in the moment. And there's definitely a certain, levity to the conversation, in that they really enjoyed what they were working on. They like the environment, and they stand by it. A lot of them do in this podcast, but it's very fascinating. There's obviously like a level to it of some accountability, but not really. And like, that's the issue, is that they're not directly talking about things like character designs. The one quote about how the game was perceived as uncool is probably the best that they were willing to sort of admit in the here and now. But like, that's true. That's the worst part about it, is that there's really not a whole lot you can do when you make something, and just straight up a large portion of the gaming audience looks at that and goes, nah, son, that is not for me. And there is no denying that, like, in the grand scheme of things, the vast majority of people did not play the game, and those are numbers we just have flat out. Most people did not play the game, but that's the other like hard part about the conversation surrounding Firewalk and Concord, is that it still was a game in a very, very deeply saturated market. I mean, I always find, well, at least I wonder how the game would have done like 15 something years earlier, right? Like if this game was like within the first year that PlayStation 4 came out, where live service was still kind of in its infancy, would this game be able to find an audience back then? Probably. Would it be able to grow and sustain itself in the same way that, an Overwatch or a Fortnite did? That would maybe be a tougher thing to say with confidence if that would happen or not, but it probably would have done a lot better versus nowadays, when it was trying to be sold a la carte. So, and definitely too, the online environment is a lot more harsh nowadays. That can exasperate in a way where sometimes it's to a company's benefit, but in a lot of cases it's to their detriment, and there's nothing you can do at that point. But man, it's cool that we got a lot of the stuff. I just wish it was definitely more candid, and there was more, because I think absolutely there's a lot of accountability that simply is not happening here. That's the tough thing. The game still is very fresh. The company is still, well, PlayStation in this case, is still around. Like, there's just a conflict of interest, and being that open about those things in what might be an unsavory light. And in this work environment for the games business, where there's been 30, 40, 50,000 redundancies, whatever the hell that number is now, because it's so insane. You want to try and just find some work and not have to make it that much harder for you to land a job. So either way, I'm glad we finally were able to talk about this, because it was like 3 weeks ago now at this point. But man, that was a fascinating one, and I hope we'll get more Concord stories as time presses on. But anyway, that's pretty much it. Thank you all so much for joining me in this conversation, and I will see you all in my next video. You take it easy.